All right, hello everyone. So I have with me the one and only, the titular Amos Wollen. Uh, and so we're gonna be talking about arguments for God. We're gonna be making a tier list where you rank the arguments from A to F, skipping E, just like occurs in the typical lettering systems in elementary, middle, and high schools in the United States and various institutions of higher education, like college and perhaps even grad school. So I guess before we go into that, Amos, do you have anything to say?
No, I'm happy to just dive in.
Okay. You don't like say who you are?
No, I prefer
Okay.
for people to figure that out as we go along. I'll drop clues as the video proceeds.
Yeah, you're gonna be like Jesus, you don't want come out and explicitly say things, but maybe you'll claim to be the Son of Man, but you won't.
It's more likely that
Okay.
I'll claim to be the reviewer's father.
Oh, good one.
Viewer's father, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so the first argument, the moral argument. So what is the moral argument? Well, the moral argument, it says that if there is no God, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God must exist. On the count of three, let's give our rankings of the arguments, okay? The argument from A to F, or S to F. 1, 2, 3, F.
D.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's F because it makes theism less probable than it would have been before, where the arguments that for theistic, the moral argument proponents, they'll try to use God to provide some foundation for morality. But the problem is, I don't think any of those accounts can succeed because of Euthyphro's dilemma, and you get this, any fact that you ground in God's nature, you're also going to have to invoke these brute facts about God's nature, so it's not a good explanatory account. So I think that God's incapable of grounding morality. But that has an interesting implication. No, Roberto, moral knowledge is not there. Moral knowledge will be discussed later. You can tell by the bit where it says moral knowledge. Oh, I guess it's hard to read. Okay, you get a pass. But I think if you think that God is incapable of grounding morality, then if you accept the premise that if there is no God, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, then that would just mean that God doesn't exist, because for God to exist, there need to be objective moral values for theism to have any predictive power. So I actually think that, if you find one of the premises of the moral argument plausible, the one where you can't have moral realism absent God, then you should be an atheist. So why do you rank it at D rather than F?
So we have the same assessment of why the moral argument is unpersuasive, but I don't give it an F because, unlike some arguments for theism, I kind of get it, right? So I get why people find this argument persuasive in a way that I don't with some of the other arguments for theism. So just to make the kind of Euthyphro criticism clearer for the audience, the thought is, okay, somebody is claiming that morality is grounded in God, either in God's nature or in God's mental states, like his desires, or constituted by his commands or something like that. And the Euthyphro dilemma says, look, okay, take the version of theistic metaethics that says morality is grounded in God's desires. Okay, does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? And if you take the claim that things are good because God wills them, then that just seems to get the order of explanation entirely backwards, and it ends up being a form of moral subjectivism. Moral subjectivism is the view that the contents of morality, moral truths, depend on the mental states of some subject. And since God is a subject, this is a form of moral subjectivism. It makes morality dependent on a subject's mental state. And so we don't want that because moral subjectivism is false. On the other horn, if you say that things are good because God wills them, then like the theistic metaethicist isn't going to want to say that because the whole claim is that morality is grounded in God. Now, what some people might say is that the moral facts are grounded in God's nature. Both objective moral values and objective moral duties are grounded in God's nature. And so God's nature is supposed to play the same role as Plato's form of the good, right? So like God's nature is the standard of goodness. And like maybe 4 years ago, this is what I used to think. So this is why I didn't put it in an F. Like I get that one could think, right, like God is like an immaterial thing. Plato's form of the good is an immaterial thing. God is good. Plato's form of the good is good. And so it seems as though both could just play the same role in one's ontology as in terms of like grounding goodness. But this fails for the reason Matthew pointed at, right? So you can pose a similar Euthyphro problem to the claim that like goodness is grounded in God's nature. So you can ask the question, why is God's nature good? Now the theist is going to say, well, it's necessarily good, but there are two types of necessities. There's like brute necessity and necessities that are explained by deeper facts. If God's nature is like brutally good, and that's like a brute necessity, then the intrinsic probability of theism will go down because God's goodness isn't explained by some more fundamental, simple property in God, like his perfection. It's just like an attribute that you've sandwiched onto this being. And like if you do that with all of the attributes, like God's power and aseity and knowledge and freedom, and you just like ram them all together without a unifying simple core explaining these other necessities, then theism will just be a ramshackle view with no significantly high intrinsic probability. And then like it won't have an advantage over rival theories that try to explain the same data. But like if you say that, okay, God's goodness is explained by deeper facts about goodness, then it's just not the case that goodness is grounded in God's nature, right? Like God's nature being good is explained by deeper facts about goodness. And if you want to say like these deeper facts about goodness are somehow in God still, that's something you can say. I just don't get how that works.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think it's vulnerable to the reasons-based version of the Euthyphro dilemma. So you ask, okay, does God have a reason for acting in certain ways or having his character be in certain ways? If he has no reason, then it just seems arbitrary. So if you ask, okay, is there a reason that God is loving? Well, if you're a theist and you accept that morality doesn't come from God, you can say, yes, there's a reason God's loving because love is good. But if you deny that, then you get a very arbitrary character. Yeah. Well, so it seems like we have an intractable disagreement, but because for this argument to work about whether it's D or F, this is a very substantial disagreement. But because for this argument to work, you have to believe in an arbitrary meta-ethics where the being who has control over all has, gets to command whatever he wants, and that's what's worth doing. In this case, I'm the one who has control over all of the tier list. And so what I say goes for this one. So I'm moving it to F. And there's nothing you can do about it. Ha ha ha. Okay, next one. The cosmological argument. Specifically, the Kalam cosmological argument, which, as William Lane Craig says that everything which begins to exist has a cause. And because the universe began to exist, the universe must have had a cause. For if the universe can pop into being from nothing, why not Beethoven or root beer? Yeah. So what do you make of this argument? Let's say on 3, okay, what we rank it. 1, 2, 3, C.
C.
Wow. Undesigned coincidences between the Amos and the Matthew. Look, and the thing that was great about that was it was a very casual pairing. It wasn't intended in the text. Neither of us were riffing off the other one. It was a casual harmonization, just like between the Gospels.
Matthew, like we have the recording. You can go back. You waited to see what I was going to say before you said C. You paused, right? It's like people who play rock paper scissors and then you just wait. a second and then and then
No, I think there's
that
delay.
coincidence was designed.
No, I think there's delay between the audio on both ends because I heard you saying it after me.
Yeah. I don't think that's
So
true, but let's carry on.
Yeah.
I'm accusing you of lying.
I see. Okay. So, okay, why do you think it's a C? I can first give the reason I think it's a C. I mean, basically, sure. I think it's a C because it's not like obviously a terrible argument. I can see why a person would accept the argument, but like I certainly don't think you have to accept the argument. Where like I think it's one of those arguments where it's like if you accept these like 4 controversial views, then God exists. But then if it's not going to be that much evidence because unless you're really inclined to accept all the views. So like I find, I think it's kind of plausible that you could have the universe without a cause that just begins to exist, where contrary to what people often indicate, it doesn't pop into being from nothing, but it just doesn't come from anything. I think, and that's going to be even more plausible if you have accept the B theory. And then I also think that that even if you think that something timeless made time exist, then I think there are like models on which time is emergent, and so you can have time begin to exist. And now I'm inclined to personally accept causal finitism, where I think that you can't have an infinite number of past events. But that's another thing. You have to think that there can't be an infinite number of past events.
Infinite number of like an infinite causal chain, not an infinite number of past events, right? So like if they were causally disconnected, you could believe in them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so that's why I think it's not a great argument. I can see why a person would accept it, but I don't think it's super convincing.
Yeah.
What do you?
I mean, so I have the same kind of general feeling about the Kalam, where it's like the conjunction of these claims might be true, but it's sort of not clear to me that they are. And some of the issues I feel are kind of beyond my ken at the moment. So like all of the cosmological arguments, and by cosmological arguments, I don't just mean the cosmological argument. I mean the cosmological arguments for premises within cosmological arguments from cosmology. It doesn't seem like there's really any consensus among the professional physicists, and without that, and without having any kind of a physics background, I would never have the temerity to assume a view on like which theory of the universe is past makes best sense of the physics. So like I'm completely agnostic about these kinds of arguments, and like the only thing that could decide my opinion at the moment one way or the other, polls showing a strong supermajority of cosmologists leaning in one direction or the other. As far as
you don't feel yourself qualified to like ponder the implications of the Borde, Guth, and Vilenkin theorem?
I mean, so like that's obviously very easy, but lots of physics downstream of that can get a little bit tricky. Like on the philosophical side, I think like me and Matthew are kind of like the exact opposite of which premises of the Kalam we find we're more inclined to accept. So I'm inclined to accept premise 1 that what begins to exist has a cause. I don't think some of Craig's arguments for that premise are persuasive, so I don't think Craig's inductive argument for that premise succeeds, for example. The argument for that premise I accept is just an argument based on intuition. So it seems to me that whatever begins to exist has a cause. It seems metaphysically impossible for something to begin to exist from nothing. And so, and like the from there is in air quotes, but like you get the point. And so like the problem with arguments from intuition is that sometimes people don't share your intuition. And I take it that Matthew just doesn't share my intuition about this, but I have the intuition. And so I think I'm okay to believe it. As far as like the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, I'm not persuaded by Craig's arguments from the impossibility of actual infinites or the impossibility of forming one by successive addition. We can go into like why I don't find those super persuasive, but like it seems like there's a general consensus gravitating towards defending the second premise based on the causal finitism that Matthew mentioned. And like I haven't read Pruse's book. I flipped through it. I think even if I read it, I would only understand about a tenth of it. And so like I just can't see myself like having like endorsing any grand theory of like how to solve infinitary paradoxes anytime soon. So I just don't know about this one.
Yeah. So I think we both have sort of a similar view that it rests on these kind of controversial premises, and so they're sufficiently controversial that it's hard to be confident in it. But we disagree about which premises are controversial. But yeah, I find the idea of just like a past infinite, that just seems impossible to me. Where a past infinite chain, that can't be. That yeah. Okay, psychophysical harmony. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. S.
S.
Yeah.
S for psychophysical harmony.
Yeah. So I think this is a great argument. One of the greatest arguments, perhaps in the history of the world. We should explain the argument because most people don't know what it is because our school system has failed. So the idea behind the psychophysical harmony argument is that there's this pairing between the physical and the mental. So for instance, suppose Amos and we're hanging out and I think I'd like to just ferociously slap Amos, which I often do. Then, I have the ability, I think I'd like to ferociously slap Amos, and just my arm, it just reaches out and ferociously slaps Amos. And Amos then would like respond appropriately by pulling his head away, And so the idea is that this is a very hard to explain pairing between the physical and the mental, where you could have a world that's physically identical to ours, but with different mental states. Where, for instance, imagine, when I think I'd like my arm to go up, my arm goes up. But the point is, it doesn't have to be that way, right? So it could be that I think I'd like my arm to go up, and instead, like, I move my leg. And if the physical states, so the physical states give rise to mental states, which give rise to physical states. But the point is, you could swap out the mental states and get the same chain of physical states. And so then it becomes very inexplicable that the physical and the mental are paired in such a harmonious way that when you desire for your arm to go up, for instance, it goes up rather than there being some other stimulus. Now, lots of people think you can get out of this by evolution. You definitely cannot. Apologetic Squared has a good video on this. Amos has a good article on this at his blog, which is linked below. The basic idea is that evolution doesn't solve it because you could have a world with exactly identical behavior, but that's psychophysically disharmonious. You just swapped around the mental states, but kept the physical states the same. And so then it becomes inexplicable why we happen to be in a world where there are where there are mental states that are harmoniously paired with the physical states. So because the consciousness itself, as there's no necessary pairing between it and the physical stuff, and so you could switch it around. Now, and even if you think that there is a necessary pairing, the argument still works. And this is something I Apologetic Squared. He told me about this, where so even if you think that that there's a relationship between the physical and the mental that's knowable a priori, so you don't even need to have any experience to know that certain mental states give rise to physical states. It still is not. You still get evidence, even if you could know it a priori, as long as you yourself have not yet figured it out a priori, then you still get evidence for theism from psychophysical harmony. So imagine, because there are so many ways that it could pair in disharmonious ways. So So to illustrate this, imagine that. And sorry, I realize this explanation's been all over the place, but imagine that we're talking about. So imagine that there are two hypotheses about why the digits of pi are what they are. And the first one is that God made the digits of pi what they are specifically, so that they could be what they are. And the second hypothesis is that the digits of pi are just sort of generated randomly by the mathematical process. If you saw that the digits of pi, if converted to binary, spelled out in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, etc., and kept going for several paragraphs, that would be good evidence that God designed the digits of pi, because even though the digits of pi are a priori knowable, it's very unlikely that what they would happen to a priori line up with are this harmonious pattern. And so similarly, even if it's necessary, given that it could be necessarily a huge number of other things, then it's very improbable inherently that there would be psychophysical harmony. So, this argument, it's great. It's very convincing. I don't know. Do you have anything to say about it, Amos?
Yeah, so I thought that was a good explanation for people who haven't encountered the argument for the first time and are having trouble following it. I recommend the two things about it on my blog. So basically, there was a friend of mine who really wasn't understanding the argument, because even though she was very smart, she had no background in philosophy of mind, and so it's very difficult to communicate the concepts unless you have a solid grasp on these notions. So I basically wrote the argument from psychophysical harmony in like a Socratic dialogue form, in a way that didn't use any academic philosophy of mind jargon. And so like I recommend that as a good place to just like get a handle on the argument, because it took me about a month to understand it fully. Like some people immediately get it, some people just don't. Like it doesn't make sense to them immediately, and for me it didn't make sense to me all at once. But like when it did, I converted to theism. So like this argument made me from agnostic to theist about a year ago. And so like not only is it a very convincing argument, I give it an S because it was the argument that actually made me a theist. And like it's fairly rare for these kinds of philosophical arguments to change people's mind, but this argument did change my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I think, one of the three best arguments for God. There are three really good arguments for God, and then lots of lousy ones. Yeah. Okay, so, yeah, and I also recommend that dialogue. It's very well written. It's funny. It involves incorrect spelling of the word eggplant as Oborgene. We all know it's spelled eggplant. Or is that how you spell aubergine, or whatever you Brits call it?
Aubergine. I'm not sure. But like if you just like Google correct spelling of eggplant, the spelling of aubergine will come up.
Yeah. Okay, what is this argument? The ontological argument. Yeah. Okay. On the count of three, let's say it. 1, 2, 3. D. Wow. Undesigned coincidences. Harmonious pairings that are inexplicable. Yeah. So okay, what is the ontological argument? Well, there are a few different ones. Some of them are lousy, and others are just as bad, to quote G.A. Cohen. But he was talking about something else. But so the ontological argument, it'll try to argue that you can deduce that God exists just from like logic alone, where you don't have to observe anything about the world. You don't have to, know that stuff exists. It's just like you can just from logical axioms derive that there is a God or something like that. And so like a basic version of the ontological argument is you say God is the greatest possible being. And then you say, but a being is great by definition. Then you say a being is greater if it exists than if it doesn't. And so God exists. And, there are more technical philosophical formulations. But I think, that original version, that gets an F, as does the, various other versions. But There are like a few versions that I think don't work, but it's not quite so obvious that they don't work. Like Gödel had a sort of complicated ontological argument that almost certainly does not succeed, but it's like maybe it does. And I, on my blog, have an argument called the argument from modal limits, which is an ontological argument, which that's the one I like best. That one also probably fails, but I think the reason why it doesn't get an F is that it can help raise the prior probability of theism, because like if you think that there's a, let's say, 1 in 1,000 chance of a successful ontological argument, well, then your prior probability in theism can't be that much below 1 in 1,000, unless you think there are strong a priori arguments against theism. And so as a result, it'll establish that theism has at least a reasonable prior. And given that there are, infinite ways fundamental reality can be, then establishing that one of them has like a reasonable prior is that gives it a pretty big boost. So that's what I think is good about the argument, but it's not that persuasive. And the original Gödelian version just trivially fails because all it establishes is that it follows from God's definition that he exists, not that God actually exists. So just like, the smallest actually existing Martian, it follows from that definition that it exists, but that doesn't mean that there is any such Martian. And, you can make the argument more more rigorous logically. But I think J.H. Sobel has successfully shown that it rests on just a kind of subtle logical error. But yeah, I mean, showing exactly where it goes wrong in the different formulations gets kind of technical, but it does go wrong. I don't know. What do you have to say about the ontological argument, Amos?
Yeah, I mean, so I've sort of forgotten how Gödel's argument went. Like the two ontological arguments that I've thought most about are the Anselmian argument and Plantinga's modal ontological argument. I think those are the two versions of the ontological argument that the philosophers who accept the argument are most persuaded by today. So maybe we should just say how Plantinga's worked. The basic thought is it is metaphysically possible that a necessary being like God exists, and therefore and then it just follows that like it's necessary that the necessary being like God exists. And so like couched in the language of possible worlds, you say it is possible that a maximally great being exists. If it's possible that a maximally great being exists, a maximally great being exists in at least one possible world. If a maximally great being exists in at least one possible world, a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. But if it exists in all possible worlds, it exists in the actual world, so it exists. And the main issue, so like you can question the systems of logic that allow you to get from like something is possibly necessary to something is necessary. So like the system, so like system S5 and then a weaker system called T, and like there are complicated debates about whether these systems are like correctly describe metaphysical modality, but the real problem that most philosophers have with the argument is with premise one, the claim that it's possible that God exists. And of course, all theists will agree that it's possible that God exists because actuality entails possibility. But the trouble is trying to persuade non-theists to accept the premise that it's possible that God exists. Given that you can run an equally prima facie convincing version of the argument the other way, right? So like it's possible that there is no God, blah, 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 to like the conclusion that there is no God in the actual world. So what you need is a symmetry breaker between like the possibility premise that like it's possible God exists, with the possibility premise that no God exists. And like there are a bunch of attempts to do this, but like they all strike me as kind of insane. For an example of one, Alexander Proust had this argument from what he calls the Sankara principle. So the Sankara principle says that if it seems to you that something is actually the case, then it's possible that it's the case. So if you ingest LSD, and like so like if Matthew ingested LSD and he saw like a big purple version of me stomping around his bedroom, he shouldn't infer from that I actually exist, but what he should infer is that it's possible that I exist, right? So like if he can have like a vivid, phenomenal representation of something as existing, then it's at least possible that it exists. But like religious mystics have had phenomenal representations of God, like they've had experiences as of God existing. And so according to Proust, this gives justification to the possibility premise that it's possible that God exists. Like there are a few problems with this. One is that like they haven't had experiences as of a necessary being, right? Because like phenomenologically, I think there's no way that you could distinguish between a concrete object being contingent and a concrete object being necessary. Like the mystics surely like can't phenomenologically distinguish between Richard Swinburne's God and Alvin Plantinga's God. There's just no way that they can do that.
They can because they experience God's greatness, and Alvin Plantinga's God is greater because he's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, like I think that's false. But even if it wasn't false, surely there's like a cap on how much greatness a person could experience, right? Like you can experience a lot of greatness, but you can't like experience maximal greatness. There's no way you can phenomenologically distinguish between like a maximally great being and a really great being who knew everything apart from the number 7. Like there are a few other problems with the argument, and there are like a gazillion other attempted symmetry breakers. I just haven't been persuaded by any of them. But like Matthew said, the mere possibility that one of them works and the fact that they've been defended by smart people raises the prior on theism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the modal ontological argument, because remember, we're talking about the possibility of necessary things. And if something is possibly necessary, then it just is necessary. So one of the premises amounts to basically God exists necessarily. And an atheist would not accept that premise. So I don't think the argument works.
But I mean, it's so like only if you accept S5 and T, right? So like you wouldn't accept that those are like logically entailing if you didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should accept S5. I think it's kind of, at least that part of S5 is pretty trivial. But okay, yeah, I think we largely agree. Okay. Yeah, that's an argument. And so we're using the fine-tuning argument slightly more broadly to include an argument from just the broader fact that we have laws that result in anything interesting. So it's both the fact that the constants are finely tuned and that we have laws that produce stuff that's interesting and valuable. So yeah, so I guess on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, S.
B.
Wow. We have a massive disagreement. Though fortunately, there's something between these two where it'll be A in the middle. I think this argument is roughly as good as the argument from psychophysical harmony. Okay, think about all the simplest laws. Okay, are you thinking about them? All of them, all at once? Okay, so yeah, I'm glad. So all of the simplest laws, one thing they have in common is they don't result in anything interesting. So here's a very simple law. You have a bunch of particles and they all move around in a circle, or they move around in a square or a triangle or a hexagon or any of the infinite sides. Or they all move in a circle at 1 mile per hour or 2 miles per hour or 3 miles per hour or 4 miles per hour. All of those worlds are much simpler than our world. And so if there are an infinite number of worlds that are simpler than our world and do better in terms of theoretical virtues, then the prior probability of a world like ours, just having complex laws, is 0, because there are an infinite number of worlds that are more likely. And so you have this really striking fact, which is the laws that's very surprising, which is that you get laws that result in stuff that's interesting. And it's very valuable. If the laws got nothing interesting, then we wouldn't exist. There would be no consciousness. Nothing would happen. And the things that support theism are things that are improbable and valuable. So, okay, so that's the initial case for the argument. And then where I think that's the most convincing version of the argument. But then you also just note the fact that the constants are finely tuned, where if you tweak them slightly, life wouldn't arise. Well, that's It's not clear exactly how strongly expected on theism that is, but that's really, really surprising on atheism. On atheism, if you tweak the constants by 1 part in 10 to the power of 100, then just like life could never risen. And so it's very lucky that we got in this very narrow range. And then the last part that favors the argument is, I think, Robin Collins' fine-tuning for discoverability. Why I'm not super sure about the physics. Collins is a smart guy, where he says if you tweak the laws slightly, then we couldn't have discovered fundamental facts about the universe. And that avoids the multiverse objection, because we could have still existed in a world where the laws weren't finely tuned for discoverability. We just wouldn't have been able to discover the laws of the universe. So it's very weird that we're in one of the discoverable universes. And then on top of that, I just think all the objections to the argument are wrong. So I won't list every objection, but I'll just list a few. So one common objection that people give is they say, well, they appeal to the anthropic principle, where they say, of course, it's not surprising that that you exist, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have been around to know it. Okay, but that is not a valid inference. The fact that if P hadn't happened, you wouldn't know about it does not mean that P happening is not evidence for anything. So I'll give you an example. Suppose, there's a famous case by John Wesley, where suppose a firing squad with 100 people, they all shoot at one guy, and he survives. He should think, okay, there's something fishy going on. Maybe there's a conspiracy, or maybe like their guns all jammed. Okay, so, he should think something fishy is going on. But if he had died, he wouldn't have been around to observe. So you could argue in the same way, well, if you had died, then he wouldn't have been around. But nonetheless, he obviously gets good evidence for a conspiracy or something like it from the fact that 100 guns all jam at the crucial moment. Or another example I like that's very analogous to the fine-tuning case is from the fact that you exist, you get good evidence that your parents did not try to abort you. Because even though if they had successfully aborted you, you wouldn't exist. Because of that, the fact that you do exist is evidence that they did not try to abort you. And so I think this objection is just total garbage. And then, one thing people like to say is maybe there are more fundamental laws that fix the constants. But that does not help solve the problem, because you could have fundamental laws that set the constants to any level, where it's equally probable that you would have a fundamental law that fixes the constants to being in any of the disharmonious ranges. So it would be a little bit like saying, you get 100 royal flushes in a row in poker, and you say, well, maybe there's just a fundamental law of the universe that I get 100 royal flushes in poker. Well, that's not a good theory, because it's no more likely that there would be 100 that they would give you royal flushes than that they would give you something else. And then, this also doesn't explain why there are laws at all that result in anything interesting. Because, just the simplest laws that have just things go in a circle or something, those laws, okay, they do not result in higher order laws for finely tuning of the constants. They just result in random noise. They result in nothing interesting. And then the best objection to fine tuning, I think, is the multiverse. But the problem with the multiverse is in order for the multiverse to be simple, you have to have fundamental laws that predict the existence of many universes. So you have fundamental laws that do things, and then universes pop out. But those are very finely tuned laws. The vast majority of possible laws just have stuff move around in boring ways rather than getting universes. And also it's very difficult to get a multiverse. Well, it doesn't solve fine tuning for discoverability. It doesn't explain why the laws result in anything interesting at all. And it also, lots of models of the multiverse themselves have to be finely tuned. If you look at the existing models, where if you tweak them slightly, life wouldn't arise. And a lot of them get what are called Boltzmann brains, where they get just lots of brains that fluctuate into existence in the recesses of space and then die quickly. And so if you accept that follows from the multiverse, then that means that you're in a skeptical scenario, probably, because most of the people with experiences like yours are these short-lived Boltzmann brains. And so as a result of that, many multiverse models undermine induction. And then lots of multiverses are infinite, in which case that'll also maybe undermine induction. So there's a whole mess of problems. And so I just think this is a really convincing argument. So Amos, tell me, why am I wrong?
Oh yeah, so like I don't claim that you're wrong. I just don't have a strong view on the multiverse objection. So like everything you're saying and everything that proponents of fine-tuning arguments say about the multiverse objection sounds right to me, but I just haven't read enough to have a strong view as far as like appeals to the anthropic principles, or the necessitarian response, where the claim is that like the fine-tuning constants are necessary, or there's like an underlying set of constants that explains the full constants. Like I definitely don't think those work, but I just don't have strong views on the multiverse.
Yeah, well, what do you make? I mean, I think that the others are a little bit more technical, but I think, just the simplest way to show that the multiverse doesn't solve the problem is you just say, think about, you have to have some laws to get a multiverse for it to be simple. So you have to have some laws where the laws do stuff, and then from there, it predicts the existence of many universes. But the vast majority of fundamental laws just produce random static. So if you have the particles just moving in circles, no multiverses will ever form. Or if you have them just bouncing around randomly, no multiverses will ever form. Or if you have them, moving around very quickly in circles, no. And so all the simplest laws do not get a multiverse. And there are an infinite number of very simple laws, none of which get a multiverse. And so our particular universe will be in this very, very small set of epistemic space.
Yeah, no, that sounds right to me. And I think the a priori version of the fine-tuning argument generally is more persuasive. I just don't have super strong views.
Okay,
like, that sounds right to me, but I need to think about it more.
So I said S, you said B. So I guess we can compromise at A.
Okay, yeah.
If we wanted to be ecumenical, I could say that you sold me on the argument just being an A tier argument. You could say I convinced you to bump it up to an A tier argument, where like we sort of converge on but that didn't happen. I still think it's an S tier argument. Yeah. But okay, but we have to compromise here. Okay.
Yeah.
Next one, the anthropic argument. Okay.
But bump it up to an S tier, because I don't think you should have to compromise for my ignorance. I don't think that's fair. I don't think I should drag you down.
I don't know.
About this
wow, that's so kind.
I know.
Wow, I sold you on it being an S tier argument. Okay,
I'm just deferring to you on it.
Wow, that's what I typically do. I defer to myself. What my considered judgment is, that's usually the ultimate judgment I affirm. Okay, next one, the anthropic argument. Okay, on the count of 3, let's say it. 1, 2, 3, S.
S.
Yeah. Okay, so what the frickle frackle is the anthropic argument? Do you want to explain it, Amos?
Yeah, okay, so like the basic...
Because I don't know what it is. I have no clue.
Yeah, right. I mean, Matt joking meant to the argument. But like the rough gloss on it is, okay, listen, atheist, you exist. Do you concede that much? Okay, you do. Well, on theories of the world that predict there would be like between 0 and some finite number of all the possible people, the probability that you would exist is 0, because like it's like a finite share of an infinite set. Like the probability of some number in that finite set being like randomly selected is 0. And so the probability that you would exist out of the set of all possible people, if we concede that the set of all possible people is infinitely large, is 0 on views of the world on which only a finite number of people would exist at most. And so what you really need is a theory that says every possible person exists, because any theory short of that, the probability is going to end up being 0 of your existence. And so there are only really 2 theories that do this. One is maximizing theism, which says God is the best possible being. As such, he would create the best possible world. And the only way to create the best possible world is to create every possible person and give them who could possibly have a positive welfare level and then benefit them infinitely. And so, like, given that that entails that every possible person would exist, that entails that you would exist, since you're one of the possible people. And so the probability of your existence on this version of theism is 1. There's also modal realism, which is the view that all possible worlds exist in the way that the actual world does, but like the term actual is an indexical, which just picks out the world that we happen to inhabit. But like, really, there's nothing special about the actual world. It's just the same as all of the possible worlds. And like, on this analysis of possibility, it'll turn out that like every possible person does exist in some possible world. And like, this also predicts your existence with probability 1 on the modal realist analysis of what it means to be one of the possible people. And so like, it ends up just being a tug of war between maximizing theism and modal realism. And maximizing theism totally wins this tug of war because like the objections to modal realism are way more decisive than the objections to theism. One objection to modal realism that Matthew and I both endorse is that modal realism undermines induction. And like a second objection, I don't know if Matthew endorses it, but like, I think that modal realism definitely gives you the wrong analysis of possibility. So like,
I do endorse that.
What I'm asking, you endorse that too?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So like, this is an objection that Saul quickly raised. Many other people have raised it. But like, the intuitive thought is this. When I say like, it's possible for me to have not done this stream, the way that the modal realist analyzes that statement in a way that comes out true is to say that in some nearby possible world, there's a counterpart of me, someone who's a lot like me, who didn't do the stream. But I think that's just clearly not anything close to what I meant by the claim that it was possible for me not to have done the stream. When I'm saying that, I'm making a claim about me, what's possible for me, not what some counterpart does, right? And so like, this leads me to think that the modal realist has a bad analysis of possibility. And like, the modal realist will come back and say, well, yeah, but like, all of the other theories of metaphysical modality have implausible conclusions, and modal realism is elegant in blah, blah, blah ways. But yeah, I'm inclined to think that objection is fairly decisive. And so theism wins.
I agree. I mean, so the basic idea is you can show pretty plausibly that there's that the number of possible people is at least Beth 2. Okay, so what's Beth 2? Well, so the infinities go, the smallest infinity is Beth 0. Then it's not clear if this is the second smallest infinity, but it's at least near the second smallest infinity is Beth 1, and then Beth 2 is bigger than that. And so the number of like, numbers of I think they're called, I always mix up natural and the number of natural numbers, I think, which are the numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's Aleph null. The number of real numbers, which include 1, a half, pi, so infinite non-repeating decimals, the number of those is Beth 1. And the number of Beth 2 is even more than that. The number of Beth 2, the same procedure that gets you from Beth 0 to Beth 1 gets you from Beth 1 to Beth 2. There's no, like, I went on Wikipedia to try to see, are there like intuitive senses of how big Beth 2 is? And they were like, well, it's the size of the check something compactification functions. So if that helps you, then but that did not help me. But the point is, Beth 2 is really big. And I think it's more than that. I actually think there's probably no set of all possible people. But it's at least very plausible that there are at least Beth 1 possible people. Or at least Beth 2. And so then the question is, okay, so we know there are Beth 2 possible people. Well, suppose there's an infinite multiverse. Well, it's really hard. You have to do a lot of like creative mathematics to get a multiverse with more than Beth 0 people. So suppose you have an infinite multiverse. Well, what are the odds that I'd be one of the lucky Beth 0 out of Beth 2 people? Well, the odds are 0 because there are infinitely more possible people than there are actual people, where Beth 0 is 0% of Beth 2. And so even if you have an infinite multiverse, the odds I would exist would be 0. but I do exist. Okay, so what's the best explanation of that? Well, the best explanation of that is that all possible people exist. For if only a finite share of possible people exist, then the odds that I would exist would be 0. And so then the question is, okay, so what's the best explanation of why all possible people would exist? Well, theism has a really good explanation of that. God wants to create all possible people because it's good to create a person and give them a good life. And so he would. In the beginning would be the word, you get it. And yeah, so he'd create all the possible people. And so then it's just like, my existence is certain on theism, or maybe not quite certain because we're not sure about the assumptions, but like at least 80%. Well, on atheism, it's almost 0. And then where like I literally just don't know any atheistic model of reality that makes my existence likely, that makes my existence not a 0% probability of event. And so as a result, this will just massively favor
apart from modal realism.
Yeah, apart from modal realism, but modal realism is clearly false. And so that's the argument. Now, and the argument, there's one bit of it that's a bit controversial, which is there are 2 main views of anthropics. And in the way I've sketched it, that it only works if one of those is right. But I don't want to get too far afield. But 1, that view is definitely right. And 2, even if you're not sure if it's right, the argument still works. And there's also another version that works. So I have an article on this if people go to my blog, which is linked below, and look up like the anthropic argument for theism. Then you'll find it. But I think this is a really, really good argument. And it's especially good because it's effective against most of the rivals to theism, where for a lot of the arguments for theism, you can also explain them by like having the universe be geared towards actualizing value, or like having some value generating process, some hypothesis on which fundamental reality carries about bringing about value. But the anthropic argument, it's not like that, because you need something not merely that wants to bring about good stuff, but you need something of truly unfathomable power to be able to create literally all possible beings, an uncountably infinite number of them. And that's hard to do. I think this is very difficult to explain away if you're not a theist.
So like one thing to add on that point is like, presumably you can predict the anthropic data by adopting the strongest form of axiarchism, which just says like there's some principle which has the power in conjunction with some facts about the universe to bring about the best possible world. And like, given what we said, that the best possible world contains every possible person, like the strong forms of axiarchism would predict everyone's existence with probability 1. The problem with this theory, though, is that it entails theism, right? So like, if it entails that all the possible people exist who it would be good to exist, then like God is going to be among the persons who it would be good to exist. And so like to have a strong form of axiarchism where God doesn't exist, you have to argue that like when considering the world as a whole, it would be axiologically better if there is no God. And there's no good argument for that. In mine and Matthew's debate, I tried to give an argument for that, and it was entirely ridiculous.
It sucked.
It was maybe the worst thing I've ever said, but like I think it's probably the best thing that can be said along those lines. And so, if you adopt a strong form of axiarchism, you've essentially adopted theism. So it's not an alternative to theism, and you may as well just skip the middleman and start out with God.
Yeah, actually, I think maybe we have time to explain the SIA versus SSA debate. So there are 2 views of how to do anthropic reasoning. The first one is called the self-indication.
Wait, sorry. Oh, yeah. You just said the acronym. I thought you were just about to go in and just like talk about the differences between SIA and SSA without saying what they were. Sorry, carry on.
So the self-indication assumption, it says basically you should reason. It says something like you should reason as if you're randomly selected from all the possible people. So upon finding out that you exist, you should think there are probably a lot of people, because if there are a lot of people, the odds I would be one of them are higher. In contrast, the self-sampling assumption says that you should reason as if you're randomly selected from the actual people in your reference class. So your reference class is the people that are roughly like you. So lots of, one example of a reference class that a lot of people use, they just say all the conscious beings. So after you observe that you exist, you should think you're kind of a random member of the beings that actually exist. So if you find out that you come to know that you exist, you should think, okay, probably I'm pretty representative of all the beings that exist. And so now you might think this argument assumes SIA because it assumes that more people is likelier. Okay, but a few points. The first one is that if you adopt SSA plus atheism, your existence is super unlikely because SSA says that you should think you're representative, that the people who are in your reference class, there aren't too many of them that are different from you. But on SSA, there are probably like the universe could be really big, such that your reference class could be infinitely large. And so then only 0% of your reference class would be on Earth. And so as a result, in order to have your reference class be to have a universe that's just the right size so that there's some life, but just small enough so that your reference class isn't super big, it requires this very specific degree of fine-tuning. So I think if you're an atheist plus an SSA or the views, it's completely doomed, where it just makes your existence super improbable. Now, what's the odds of your existence on theism plus SSA? I don't know. It's kind of unclear, but probably better than the odds of atheism plus SSA, where maybe God would only make one group. I don't think so. I think for the reasons I described, but most Christians seem to think God would only create one civilization. It's not totally crazy. And so if that's true, then because SSA gives you a reason to think there aren't too many people who are different from you, then SSA gives you a reason to think that you're kind of representative. Okay, so that's SSA. And so that's the first thing, where if SSA is true, then you probably wouldn't exist. If SSA and atheism are, and so SSA plus conditional on SSA, your existence probably still confirms theism. Second, SSA plus theism, if you're not sure between SIA and SSA versus theism and atheism, the fact that you exist will favor SIA plus theism, because SIA plus theism entail that you'll exist. SSA plus theism, it's not clear if that entails that you'll exist, but let's even say that SSA plus theism means you won't exist. Well, SIA plus atheism and SSA plus atheism both make it unlikely that you'd exist for the reasons I explained earlier. And so on account of that, the fact that you exist gives you good evidence for SIA over SSA. Okay, so that's the one thing where even if you adopt SSA, then theism is still more probable. And then the other thing is that SIA is just obviously a better view than SSA by a million miles, and it's not even close. It's the most lopsided philosophical topic, in the history of philosophical topics, where I have an article on my blog if people want to read about this in more detail, called "Alternatives to SIA Are Doomed." But the basic idea is if you adopt SSA or any alternative to SIA, you can show that you have strong a priori reason to think that the world will end soon. Because if the world doesn't end soon, then it's weird how early you are. And so you get strong probabilistic evidence that the world will end soon. Where if you think that a world in where things last longer, if you think that you're a representative member of the world, then you get evidence that there aren't too many people who are different from you. And so you get evidence that there won't be a vast number of people in the future. But it seems very weird that we could just figure out what'll happen, whether we'll go extinct just by the fact that you exist. And you can get even stranger results. So Bostrom has a case where, Adam and Eve, they're in the garden, and they're thinking of having sex. And then the serpent's like, you can have sex because Eve won't get pregnant, because if she did, then you'd have a bunch of descendants, and then you'd be super early. And so then your reference class would be filled with all these people who come after you. And you can show that this view it'll apply to any view other than SIA. I'm writing a paper that presses the point. But so the basic point is SIA is just an infinitely better view than SSA, and SIA makes theism really probable. And it's just straightforward probabilistic reasoning. It's just like, I exist, okay, and that's likelier if there are more people. Just like if you find out that there's, suppose there's some machine that generates numbers, and you're like, I wonder if it generates, and then you give it some infinite non-repeating decimal, and it did generate that number, then you would have evidence that it generates a lot of numbers, because that makes it more likely that it would generate that particular number. So that's the basic idea. There's a lot more to say about this, which, if you want to see more about it, I did a debate with Joe Schmid, or not really a debate, just like a chat on this channel about it. And then I also have a bunch of blog posts about it. So yeah, you can check that out. But okay, next one, or the contingency argument. Or do you have any last words on the anthropic argument?
No, that was all good.
Yeah. So the contingency argument, okay, let's give it a ranking on the count of 3. Wait, actually, I need to think about my ranking. I'm undecided between 2 letters. I'll say what the 2 letters are, and then we can decide which.
No, don't be a fence sitter. You have to just take a stand.
I have to.
Yeah. Ridiculous.
Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3. C.
B.
Yeah, I was undecided between B and C. Oh, Marlon from the Gospel Truth says, "What's up, Matthew? Hello." Yeah. So, I don't know. So, I think. So okay. So what do you want to explain the contingency argument for those who might be ignorant of it?
Yeah. Right. So like the contingency argument for theism comes in 2 stages. So the first stage of the argument, you give some reason to think that reality has a necessary layer, and then the second stage of the argument is you try to show that the necessary layer of reality, aside from necessity, has a whole bunch of other divine properties such that it's most plausibly God. And like the second stage 2 of the contingency argument tends to be the more controversial stage. So a lot of agnostics and atheists accept the first stage, that there's some necessary constituent of reality, but they're just not persuaded by the additional arguments that the part of reality is God or is perfect or anything like that. So like, why do people think that there's a necessary layer? Well, there are about like 1 billion variations of the contingency argument. Like there are so many arguments for the conclusion that there's a necessary being. If you go on Josh Rasmussen's website, necessarybeing.com, you can take a quiz where you just say yes or no to a bunch of yes, no, or undecided to a bunch of seemingly plausible propositions, and then about 5 questions in, a thing will pop up saying, "Aha, you've been had. You believe in a necessary being," and then it shows you the proof, given the premises that you plugged in and agreed with for the existence of a necessary being. I remember a time where Matthew was telling me there's almost no chance that there's a necessary being, so I told him to take this quiz, and he took it over and over again, and like he just kept losing until eventually the only way that he could get out of the conclusion that there was a necessary being through the quiz was just to click undecided for each of the questions. And so, like, what's the thought? Okay, well, like, there are contingent things. Contingent things seem to require an explanation for their existence, right? So, like, if we're walking through the woods and we observe a small round orb, it would be strange if like one of us thought this orb has no explanation for its existence. It's unexplained. It just exists brutally. We think no, there has to be some explanation for the existence of the orb. But like, suppose we kind of blew the orb up and up and up until it were the size of the universe, and it just like contained all of the constituents of the physical universe. It doesn't seem like the size of the orb makes a principal difference. It seems like we want to say the set of all contingent things also needs an explanation. And since it's the set of all contingent things, the explanation can't itself be a contingent thing. But like there are only three types of things: necessary things, impossible things, and contingent things. Impossible things obviously can't explain the totality of contingent existence because they're impossible. And it can't be a contingent thing because otherwise that would be included within the set. And so the only option is to say that the totality of contingent things are explained by a necessary thing. And then the contingency arguers go on to say, well, like this is probably God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so my view is I don't accept that there's a necessary thing. I think, it's not totally crazy that there is, but I don't know, because it seems like whatever is at the core of fundamental reality, it seems like it could have been otherwise. And so it doesn't seem like there could be a necessary thing. And I mean, the Rasmussen website, it's sort of a fun trick, but I mean, it does sort of play a little bit fast and loose with logical formalisms, where you'll agree to one thing, and then the way in which it'll be used in the argument is like, it's not really what you agreed to. I don't have any examples on hand, but it is sort of cheating a little bit. But
so you're
yeah,
accusing Josh Rasmussen of cheating, but you don't have any examples.
That's right.
Saying, Matthew.
Yeah. So, but I kind of like the second premise. I think that one's more plausible, where that if there's something necessary, then it's God. And I used to think that this premise was just a total failure, but I think there's a good argument for it, which I heard recently, which is, so, if we grant that things need to have explanations for why they are, then if you had some necessary thing at the core of reality, then it would be if you had something necessary at the core of reality, then whatever is possible, it would have to be able to bring about, right? Because nothing else could bring about anything, because this is the necessary thing, and so nothing else for anything to be brought about, it would have to either be brought about by this or by something else. But this is the only necessary thing, and the other stuff can't be brought about by any contingent things, because the contingent things would depend on their explanation for this thing. And so this thing would have to be able to bring about all possible worlds. But that's just what being omnipotent is. Or at the very least, it provides a good reason to think something is omnipotent. Maybe the definition of omnipotence is slightly different. But so that this would show that it's omnipotent. So I kind of like that premise, but I don't find the first premise plausible. The reason I think this is an okay argument, and I think maybe this gets a B tier thinking more about it, is that it establishes that theism has a reasonable prior. Because if you think that, suppose you think there's a 10% chance that each stage works, then you'll think that theism sort of starts with about 1% of the prior probability before you look at the evidence, and then just the evidence. And so it'll at least mean that theism doesn't have like a ridiculously low prior probability. And so for that, I think it can be helpful. Like if you think there's really strong evidence, like from psychophysical harmony, anthropics, and fine-tuning, then you kind of need the only way to think that the arguments for that theism isn't true is to think it starts with a really low prior or has good evidence against it. But this will establish, at least it'll kind of block out the option where you think that it has a super low prior. So yeah, I think it's an okay argument. It's not definitely nowhere near as strong as psychophysical harmony or anthropics or anything like that. But it does okay for itself.
Yeah. I mean, so a couple of things quickly. So I'm more inclined to accept the claim that there's a necessary being than Matthew is, just because Matthew and I have different views on modal epistemology. So Matthew is inclined to trust his intuitions, even about far-flung metaphysical claims, whereas I'm not inclined to trust those. I'm inclined to just discount them. Philippe Leon has a lot of work on this, arguing for a kind of mitigated modal skepticism, where you you can trust your modal intuitions and about day-to-day things, like the claim that there could be a 100-foot bicycle. You can sort of like piece together from facts that you've experienced that there could be a 100-foot bicycle, given that like you've seen, that there could be like 100-foot objects from other things, and like that metal holds fixed. And like there's no reason why metal wouldn't be able to stack up into 100 feet. But when it comes to far-flung metaphysical claims about, say, a necessary foundation to reality, I'm not inclined to trust the modal seeming that I have, where I can just imagine that it doesn't exist. So like Matthew and I have different views on modal epistemology, and that explains, I think, the difference between us. As far as like arguments from the necessary beings of God, I think the strongest are the other arguments that we've expressed, right? So they're going to be things like psychophysical harmony, the fine-tuning argument, and the anthropic argument, right? So if you can give reason to think that the universe was intelligently designed, and you think that all of reality is explained by a necessary layer, I think you could just put one and one together and locate the explanation for design or for the existence of you in the necessary layer of reality. There are other arguments that I think might work, like the one Matthew gave, but I like the contingency argument.
Yeah. Okay. So we're agreed that it's B tier. Okay, next is the argument from laws. Yeah, how strong of evidence is this? So it's just the fact that laws exist. Okay. 1, 2, 3, B.
C.
Wow. The inverse of the contingency argument. Okay, I mean, so I think that this is a decent argument, especially as part of a cumulative case where, like, a lot of things have to go right in order for you to have things like us. So you have to have physical stuff, then you have to have laws governing it. The laws have to apply to the stuff that exists. The laws have to generate something interesting, etc. So you keep going. But like, it's kind of weird that there are both laws and physical stuff when you could have one without the other on some accounts and the other without the first. And like the simplest ways, like it's just a world that's like ours minus the laws is way simpler than our world. And so it's very weird that we have laws. So for this reason, I think this is a pretty good argument. What do you think?
Yeah.
Why do you hate the law?
So I think it's some evidence for theism. I don't think it's as strong evidence as you think it is. I think the reason I don't is that I don't think theism predicts the physical stuff part. So like, I think theism predicts that there'd be conscious beings with harmonious psychologies. But I think those are the only kinds of laws that theism really predicts. So like, it doesn't predict that there would be matter governed by physical laws, because matter governed by physical laws by itself isn't valuable, and I think that God could get all of the other, or like all of the value he needs just from like engineering the psychological laws of souls in the absence of matter.
Yeah. So I think probably it's true that theism doesn't predict the existence of physical stuff, but I think atheism doesn't either. Like on both worldviews, like it's not obvious that there would be physical stuff. So I think probably just the fact that physical stuff exists is probably a wash between the worldviews. But then given that it exists, the fact that it's governed by laws will favor theism, where God has no reason to just make like inert particles. And so that's why I give it a B.
Yeah.
Are you convinced?
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think it's roughly as strong evidence as, say, the argument from consciousnness. Like sure, theism predicts this, but it's just not as strong evidence as some of the other lines of arguments that we have. It's like, it's some evidence. It's not overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a little bit weaker than the argument from consciousness, but I think the argument from consciousness is pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So wait, so B or C? What do we think?
I mean, I was saying C, but I'm happy to compromise with B if you want.
You know, you've been doing most of the compromising, so I'll compromise at C.
Okay.
Gotta be ecumenical. Okay, next is moral knowledge.
Nice.
Okay, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. A.
A.
Wow. Undesigned coincidences.
Uncanny.
Yeah. So, do you want to explain the argument?
Yeah, sure. So the thought is, we start from the claim that, like, plausibly we know moral truths. So I know that murder is wrong. And the reason I get to start from that claim
Speak
is
for yourself.
It's because it seems to me that I know that murder is wrong. Okay. But on theories, let's take standard naturalism, where we assume the hypothesis of indifference, on which like reality is indifferent to value. So like reality doesn't care one way or the other whether or not I know moral truths. The prior probability that I would have moral knowledge rather than merely moral beliefs is very, very low. So like to see this, our beliefs concerning morality on naturalism arose by a process of evolution by natural selection. And evolution doesn't care about truth insofar as it produces reliable truth-tracking cognitive faculties. Those reliable truth-tracking cognitive faculties are going to be a spandrel of some other survival-enhancing adaptation. But then, like, it's not clear that true moral beliefs are going to correlate with survival-enhancing beliefs. You can imagine, like, so like a priori, it seems like the set of moral beliefs that you'd expect on naturalistic evolution that would have the greatest prior likelihood is reproductive consequentialism, the view that like you should maximize reproduction because like that's the moral belief that will lead you to spread your genes the most. And so the prior probability that we'd have correct moral beliefs on naturalistic evolution is very low. But like even if you think it's very high, there's another moral knowledge problem. Like naturalism plus evolution seems to sever the connection between our moral beliefs and moral truths because it makes the fact that we believed true things about morality a matter of luck. And like to see this, you might think like for something to count as knowledge, you have to believe it because it's true, right? So like the fact that the thing is true has to play a part in the explanation of why you came to believe it. And on theism, the fact that murder is wrong plays a part in the causal explanation of why I came to believe that murder is wrong. Namely, because it's true, God knows that it's true, and so God took that belief and gave it to me. But on naturalism, that connection between the truth of murder is wrong and my belief that murder is wrong is severed. And so I don't ultimately believe murder is wrong because murder is true. And then it seems like the fact that I believe it is a matter of luck, and luck destroys knowledge. That's the lesson of the Gettier cases, right? So like the common thread running throughout all of the Gettier cases is luck. So like for every analysis of knowledge, like people have come up with examples where it seems like on the analysis of knowledge they gave, I could know something by luck, but it doesn't seem like knowledge. So like luck is the thing that kind of destroys knowledge. But on naturalistic evolution, it seems to be a matter of luck that I know moral facts. Whereas on theism, we'd expect me to know moral facts because it's good to know moral truths.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree with all that. And I mean, so I think if you think that, like, if you think that the reason you come to all your moral beliefs is just because of the movement of atoms in your brain, the movement of atoms in your brain is not explained at all by the moral facts. And so then your moral beliefs are not explained at all by the moral facts, but that undercuts your justification for believing in moral realism. Because if the reason that you believe some fact has nothing to do with it, that being the case, then that undermines your justification. And then I also think just abductively, like, by far the best explanation, if you think we have generally correct beliefs about morality, by far the best explanation of this is that we have some general faculty for having correct beliefs about morality. And I don't think you should think it just explains morality. There are lots of cases where it seems like we have correct beliefs. I have an article in which it's called like Response to Destin Crummett Richard Chappell debate or something, where I go through and list 27 examples of beliefs that are not about the physical world that it's not clear how evolution would have equipped us with, because they're not things that we could even in principle know from the physical world, about mathematics, modality, which possible worlds are more likely than others, etc. And so it's just the best explanation of that is that we have some general faculty for grasping the non-natural truths. But then the best explanation of us having such a faculty is theism, because if theism is true, you would expect us to have a faculty for having morality. Now, Nora Belrose
Matthew,
says,
yeah, but I was just gonna bring this up actually. Yeah, respond to Nora's comment.
Yeah. So I mean, it may be true that they would make that argument in possible worlds where they don't have moral knowledge, but I think we do have moral knowledge in the real world. So if you just deny we have any moral knowledge, you think we don't know that it's wrong to torture little babies. We don't know that suffering is worse than pleasure. We don't know that you shouldn't stab people in the eye for no reason, that it's wrong to humiliate people, etc. Then maybe the argument from moral knowledge specifically goes away. But there are lots of other types of knowledge that it seems like we have that you can't make such an argument for. So take our knowledge that induction is reliable. Well, we only are justified in believing that induction is reliable if there are lots of possible worlds where induction breaks down 1 second from now, where 1 second from now the world turns into a cantaloupe or something. And so the rules of the past don't continue into the future. But the idea that the fact that induction is reliable can't explain our beliefs about induction, because both the theory that induction is reliable and that induction has been reliable in the past, they both predict our past beliefs. So unless you think we have some way to directly access which possible worlds are likelier than others, then you get the result that contrary to what then you don't have a justification for believing in induction. So and then if that's true, then you have no justification for thinking that a table won't appear in your room 1 second from now for no reason. And if that's the intellectual price tag of atheism, then that's a good reason to think atheism is false, because I think we do have accurate inductive knowledge. And so I think, and there are all sorts of kinds of knowledge that it seems like we have that are not about physical facts, where it's not clear how evolution would equip us with them. So like, the type of knowledge I described of like knowledge about which possible worlds are likelier than others, modal knowledge, so knowledge that contradictions are impossible. How do we know that? Why is it that how do we know that contradictions are not merely not actual, but they're in fact impossible? Well, the fact that contradictions are impossible can't explain our beliefs about that, because it's not a fact about the physical world. And there are all sorts of other beliefs like that. So I don't think that the moral knowledge argument has a problem there. If people want to read more about it, I have an article called something like "The Brain Has a Special Faculty of Reasoning," where I argue for that, and I think that's best explained by theism. You can also watch that Richard Dustin debate, which is interesting. Yeah, so I think of moral knowledge, it's a little bit misleading to frame it just as being about moral knowledge, because it's really about knowledge of non-natural facts, knowledge about things that are not just about the physical world. So yeah. Do you have anything more to say about the argument, Amos?
No.
Okay, so the next argument, I accidentally pulled up two images, but it's the argument for the resurrection from the miraculous resurrection. So the question is, okay, is the resurrection evidence good? Does it justify theism? So okay, on the count of three. 1, 2, 3, C.
D.
Oh, you think it's D? Wow. Interesting. Okay, tell me why you think it's D.
Yeah, I mean, so like, I think if it's being framed as an argument for theism, I don't think it's the strongest example of a miracle claim out there, and I think like Habermas and other defenders of the resurrection argument would agree with that. Like, it's definitely not the best attested miracle claim out there, and if you come in giving theism a low prior, this kind of evidence should not budge you up. Like what the resurrection evidence should affect your beliefs on really are about like when and how and if God has revealed himself to humans. But I don't think that almost anyone should be moved from atheism to theism or agnosticism to theism based on the resurrection evidence.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right.
Yeah,
so like then if it falls in the category of arguments that shouldn't move people to theism, given that we're doing an arguments for God tier list, it should go quite low down, even if it ranks quite highly in the arguments for specific religions, because I think I would rank it higher in the arguments for specific religions.
Yeah, yeah, you've convinced me. I think it's a D tier argument. I just don't even think that the evidence for the resurrection is that good. Where like I don't think it's good enough to convince a person who's a theist of Christianity. Where like, and Amos and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it's true that an atheist is going to have to think something weird happened in first century Roman Palestine, where a bunch of people thought that they saw Jesus risen. And maybe there was an empty tomb, though I think I deny the empty tomb. But a theist will also have to think that there's something weird going on, namely that God took a break from his general policy of not engaging miraculously in the physical world to begin waltzing around first century Roman Palestine as an incarnate version of himself, who's his son, where he is begotten by himself in this confusing Trinitarian way. And then while he's on Earth, he never like condemns slavery or espouses the germ theory of disease or anything like that, but instead like condemns hand washing, tells slaves to be obedient to their masters, curses fig trees, and describes and like has the first strong evidence, that's the first strong written evidence for his teachings having been written down about a lifetime after the events in question, in tales that are mutually contradictory and that are like not merely mutually contradictory, but that are wildly implausible. So yeah, I don't think it's that good, but okay, I'm convinced that this is this goes.
Well, I should add, like I don't endorse any and maybe all of the things that Matthew said just then. So like I'm much more iffy about the resurrection evidence. I could be convinced that it's a good argument for Christianity, but like two things would need to take place. One is I need to be convinced that like there's a reasonably good prior on the incarnation. Definitely not anything over 0.5. That would be a ridiculous demand to make. But like a reasonably good prior that something like incarnation and atonement would be expected on theism, given the reality of sin. And I'm not super convinced by the arguments that we have for that, but I'd be interested to think more about them. As far as like the historical arguments for the resurrection, Annoyingly, this is one of those cases where you can't trust scholarly consensuses because there's so much more room for bias on both sides of this debate. And so like you really do just have to become acquainted with the evidence yourself. And unfortunately, the evidence for like a layperson is ridiculously hard to assess. Like I have no understanding of New Testament Greek, though. Like I mean, like I have a tiny bit of biblical Hebrew, but like my understanding of of like the history surrounding the four Gospels is very, very weak. I would need to do a lot more reading to become convinced of an argument like this, or to like think that it's definitely weak evidence. And I plan to do that, but it will just take a lot of time.
Yeah, unlike Amos, I like to expound confidently on topics even when I haven't researched them enough. But I don't know. I do kind of have the sense where like I think it'll depend a lot on your philosophical assumptions. But my view is just I think when you read the Bible, it really doesn't seem like the type of thing that God can do. It seems would do. It seems way more consistent with what like a failed apocalyptic prophet who got some followers would do. But yeah. I mean, I think it'll depend on your philosophical assumptions. But I mean, I think I read Swinburne's arguments for like why God would resurrect and the atonement and stuff, and I just think they're terrible arguments. So I don't think they're convincing at all. And so yeah, I think it'll depend on the priors of that. But yeah, okay. Next one, the argument from eternal love. Okay, on the count of three. 1, 2, 3, C.
D.
Wow, you hate snowmen. I bet you when you see a snowman on the subway, riding the subway, you go over and commit a hate crime against it just because it's made of snow. But so okay, so what's the argument?
I commit a hate crime against it.
That is a terrible joke. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like Matthew, you invented the argument from eternal love, so why don't you take the reins on this one?
Yeah. So I was reading Gavin Ortland's book, and his book I think is pretty good. I don't find the arguments that convincing, but it's sort of well written and it's like very fun to read, and like it prevents a very hopeful vision. You sort of want theism to be true after you finish reading it. Yeah. So I was reading Ortland's book, and he quotes Olaf, which is why this is the image. And Olaf says, one thing that is eternal, love. And he's like, that seems plausible. Now, I don't know how one would intuit the plausibility of love being eternal, but we have an argument for why love is eternal, and that supports theism, which is suppose that love lasts forever. Well, then the probability we'd be loving relationships in the current moment is very high. It's in fact 1, because at any given moment we'd be engaged in loving relationships. But suppose that we only live for a finite time. Well, then the odds that we'd be having the experience of loving right now is 0, because there are an infinite number of times at which we could have the experience of loving. And so the odds that we the current moment are 0. And so then the fact that we're around to enter into relationships and love people right now, that's infinitely strong confirmation for love being eternal, which is in turn very good evidence for theism. And so, I mean, it's not the best argument in the world, but I think it's kind of plausible. Why is this wrong?
I mean, so like, I'm not sure if it's wrong, but like, there are like 1,000 kind of tricksy anthropic arguments for various batshit conclusions, and this could be one of the good ones. But it might not be, and like I'm just kind of not sure. I haven't thought about it too much. I mean, one thing that's worth saying though is that like, love is just like totally accidental to the argument. It's not really about love. It's just about like any mental state that we could be having right now. So like, it can be couched in terms of love, but like it can be couched in terms of like any other mental state we might be having. So like. I suspect that this is one of like the tricksy anthropic arguments that turns out not to be correct, but like maybe it is. I'm not sure.
Oh, I mean, I think it's kind of straightforward probabilistic reasoning. It's just like the odds that you'd be around right now are higher if you're around if you're immortal, and so then you get evidence that you're immortal.
I appreciate that, but like then again, that's what they all say. So
yeah,
I don't know.
Okay, well, I don't think this relies on much of a trick, but yeah, okay. I mean, I guess
I don't know if it relies on a trick, but like if I don't know. I mean.
I mean, do you have any idea what the trick might be that it relies on?
No. Wait, so like, should so if I'm experiencing love right now, should I think that there was never a time in which I wasn't in love, or no?
Well, so from the fact that you experience love, like you get evidence that a larger percent of your total existence will be populated by moments in which you're capable of experiencing love. And so if you live longer, if you're immortal, then theism naturally predicts that at any time, at any time, you'll be capable of engaged in loving relationships. And so then the fact that you are now is strong evidence that you're that you're capable of doing it at all times, which is strong evidence for theism.
Yeah, I mean, this seems right. Like I can follow you down the garden path, but you know, I would not bet any amount of money on this argument being sound.
I would bet any amount of money on it. I mean, I guess so. I just briefly respond to the obvious objection, which is, well, can't you make a parallel argument from suffering? So theism, if you suffer forever, then that predicts that you'd be suffering now, and so the fact that you're around to suffer now is like more strongly predicted on theism. And so from this, you conclude that your suffering will be eternal. And I mean, a few points. First is that eternal suffering doesn't favor either theism or atheism. And so it's true that, like, I think theories on which there's just reincarnation in lives like this will get support on anthropic grounds, but they're implausible for other reasons. They're not simple and stuff. So as a result, I think it will favor that, but it won't favor theism or naturalism. And then the second point is, I think the theist can just agree with that, where, if the theist thinks that suffering is appropriate for soul building, then they can just think, some finite percent of your total existence, like maybe like 0.01% of your total existence will be, living these lives where you're capable of suffering, so you can keep building your soul, where maybe you'll do that for 100 years, that's been a million years at heaven, and then go back to that or something. And I think that's maybe what a theist should say on the anthropic grounds. But I don't know, it gets a little complicated. But yeah, I think it's at least a C tier argument. So are you sticking by your guns with it being a D tier argument?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm overruling you as the one with control of the cursor. Ha ha ha. Oh ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. Okay, so next one, common consent. Okay, where does this one rank? Okay, 1, 2, 3, D. B. Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is it? Well, explain the argument and why is it a B tier argument?
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, like, here's the thought: if you find out that somebody believes some proposition, then that's going to be evidence that the proposition is true. It may not be very strong evidence, but at least some evidence. So, like, if I'm born and the doctor slaps me and then says, like, vaccines cause autism, and I've never encountered any other evidence bearing on the question, and I have no priors, I should, like, defer to the doctor's judgment. Like, the fact that this guy believes that vaccines cause autism is trivially at least some evidence that vaccines cause autism. But then, like, when I go through life, I find out that, like, many more people don't think that vaccines cause autism. In fact, like, the vast majority of people don't hold this view. Let's say this is true. I actually don't know if most people think vaccines don't cause autism. But like my credences should then shift just based on this information. Like the more people who believe a proposition, the more evidence I have that the proposition is true. It's not ironclad evidence, but it's at least some evidence. And here's how the evidence can get stronger, right? So like, so suppose I find out that like there are multiple planets disconnected in the universe across space, and they've all developed vaccines, and on those planets, the vast majority of people believe that vaccines don't cause autism. If these large majorities have come to this belief and come to it independently, that gives me very strong reason to think that vaccines don't cause autism. Okay, so like circling this back to theism, the vast majority of people believe that God exists. This is at least some evidence for theism. And moreover, so like the fact that like some people believe in God, and like the vast majority of people believe in God, is like some okay evidence for monotheism. I don't think it's super strong though, because like it turns out that the causal origins of belief in Western monotheism can like be traced back like through the Abrahamic faiths to a single source, and like if the majority of belief, like if the consensus kind of all originates from like one source, then the evidence is less strong. But like I think that we also have good evidence from common consent for like demigods and nature spirits. Yeah.
Wow, instantly walks it back.
No, I think you should have stuck with your guns on there. Is your name Eric? Anyway, so
yeah, this guy doesn't know how to spell his own name. Eric spelled with an E. What an idiot.
Okay, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, here it was. We also have some good common consent evidence for nature spirits and deities, given that like geographically disconnected communities independently came to the belief that there were nature spirits and minor deities. And so like that gives you kind of pretty strong evidence for the existence of these deities. It's not overwhelming, it's not like totally persuasive, but it's at least some evidence. And like when you pair these together, I think you get like pretty good common consent evidence for Hinduism, right? So like the vast majority of people across space and time on our planet have converged on the like disjunctive belief that either there is a kind of monotheistic God or there are like minor deities and nature spirits. Wow, J.K. Rowling is in the chat. That's so cool. Well, like, and so like if you add these together, I think you get strong evidence for Hinduism, basically. So like Hinduism affirms that there's like a traditional God, but it also says that like the God kind of like produces or emanates many kind of minor deities and nature spirits. And so like there's a very good common consent evidence for Hinduism, slightly less good but still pretty strong evidence for nature spirits, and like okay evidence for monotheism from common consent, in my view.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. So I think like the version of the common consent argument that I think is best is the common consent argument for miracles, where just like a huge percentage of the world thinks they've experienced a miracle. And like, and you'll just talk to people, and some of them will have like really convincing things to say. Like I remember I heard a story recently from some guy who was like, everything else he said was false. He was like a young earth creationist, but he told a story where like he had a heart problem where like his heart beat irregularly, and his girlfriend prayed for him, who became his wife. And then the heart problem it immediately ended. and has been fine since, and it had been a problem going on for many years. It's like, okay, maybe this guy's lying or something, but there's just just have like mmany hundreds of millions of people like this, and so that's evidence for miracles, and in turn evidence for theism. Now, I don't think this is like a totally knockdown argument, but it's at least a bit suggestive that a huge share of the population thinks that they've experienced a miracle, and they'll often tell you these stories that are kind of hard to explain away. But as for the common consent argument as an argument for theism, I don't think it's very good, because I think it's true that in general, the fact that a lot of people believe something gives you a reason to believe it. But if it's on a very sort of difficult and technical and hard to parse topic, then that makes it less justified. So for instance, like most people probably believe in the A theory of time, but I think that gives you almost no reason to believe in the A theory of time, where I think it's only in cases where you would expect most people to be able to determine the right view on a topic. And that's true of the A theory, or that's not true of the A theory, and that's not true of theism. So I don't think it's a good reason for theism. Maybe it's an okay argument for nature, spirits, or Hinduism or something, but I don't think it's a good argument.
Wait, can I comment on like your objection to the common consent argument? So if the only way you could form justified beliefs about theism were through the kind of like complicated theory comparison between atheism and like rival views, then I would agree theism would be in the same boat as the A theory of time. But if theism is true, I think it will turn out that there will be lots of ways in which people can come to justified beliefs in God that don't depend on anything philosophical, like through miracles and through religious experiences, right? And so, like, if the common consent is at least in part explained by that, then I think there's like a serious disanalogy between the A theory of time and theism.
But I think whatever it's based on, that'll be something that's available to people who are like to philosophers, right? So my view is, I think the common consent argument, it threatens to double count the evidence, because if you say most people believe because of miracles and religious experience, well, you can just make the arguments from miracles and religious experience for God. No, I think those are okay arguments. I don't think they're that convincing, but they're not nothing. But yeah, I think like you don't get maybe you get more evidence from the fact that people are convinced by them, but just the fact that lots of people believe in God, I don't think that's great evidence. But I don't know. So I think maybe our
but surely you get kind of like additional evidence for miracles merely from the fact that like everyone and their mother seems to have claimed to have experienced a miracle. Like traditional arguments for miracles zoom in on specific miracle instances, and then they try to show like, look, there's no good explanation in this case besides theism or something supernatural. But like the common consent argument is trying to like give you a kind of meta reason to think that there are lots of miracles without looking at the specific miracle instances, and like same goes for religious experiences, and then like in turn that's supposed to give you the evidence for theism. So like I don't think this is double counting, because I think that like the common consent is supposed to give you is supposed to like give you more evidence for the occurrence of miracles and religious experiences.
Okay, I mean, I think you can make the argument for miracles by just pointing out that lots of different people think they've experienced a miracle.
Well, I think that's just a version of the argument from common consent.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, so then if you're thinking that, then I think it would have a bit more force and be maybe C tier.
Yeah,
but because I thought common consent was like common belief in God, rather than common experience of miracles. So yeah, so you think it's B? So I guess C was the compromise.
Yeah,
The compromise position, the enlightened centrist position. Okay, next argument, the argument from me, from beauty, or from one property that I have. Okay, what's our ranking of beauty? On 3. 1, 2, 3, C?
C. Yeah.
Wow, more undesigned coincidences. Yeah, so I don't know. Do you want to explain the argument from beauty?
Yeah, I mean,
beautiful
like
argument.
it's hard to explain the arguments from beauty because like there are a bunch of different arguments from beauty. But like the form of the argument is that like the world contains lots of beauty, or we experience lots of beauty in the world depending on how you frame the argument. And like the experience of beauty or like the mind-independent existence of lots of beauty is supposed to be evidence for theism. Now there's also like an argument from beauty which piggybacks on the two-premise moral argument we discussed at the beginning. So it's like objective beauty exists, but like that has to be grounded in the nature of God if it's to exist at all. And so like theism is the only good grounding of objective beauty. And I think Matthew and I will agree that that version of the argument definitely fails, probably for almost identical reasons to the original moral argument, maybe plus a few others. But I think so. I think like the argument from the existence of objective beauty in the world, whether that's a persuasive argument will like depend on whether you believe in objective beauty. So like if you think that beauty is a starts independent, mind independent, non-natural property, in the way that like non-natural moral realists think that moral truths are non-natural moral properties, then I think like lots of beauty instantiated in the world is going to be evidence favoring theism over atheism. But like I'm not super convinced that beauty is a non-natural property. It might be like it's sort of plausible that beauty is an objective non-natural property in the case of like beautiful mathematical equations. But unfortunately, I'm not well acquainted with this kind of beauty because I don't understand any mathematical equations, and so it's like hard for me to gauge. But like I hear from people who are well acquainted with mathematical equations that like some mathematical equations are way more beautiful than others, and like I don't know, it's sort of semi-plausible to me that like this kind of beauty at least is non-natural. But then like okay, on top of that, so, suppose like we're just restricting our focus to the experience of beauty in the world. I think that is evidence for theism, but the reason like I rank it only at C is because I think that's just a subset of psychophysical harmony. So like a type of psychophysical harmony is the fact that we experience beauty in our surroundings. And like I think that's definitely evidence for theism. But I think to rank it higher than C would be just be to double count the evidence because we've already put psychophysical harmony at S.
Yeah, I basically agree. That was all true. Okay, the argument from Muzak. Muzac. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3, D.
D.
Wow. More undesigned coincidences. It's kind of annoying. We should have put like good arguments towards the end because we started out really hopeful, where it's like we got all the good ones out first, and now we're just we're just torching the argument. But
look, I think we convinced everyone that there's a God at the beginning, and now we're having a kind of in-house discussion among believers about which arguments we should quietly put to one side.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain what the argument from music is and why you at a D?
Do you want to explain the argument from music? I feel like I have nothing use.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. It's sort of hard to explain why, like what the argument is.
Yeah. Okay. So like, I take it that the argument from music is like a subset of the argument from beauty, which like Gavin Ortlund pioneered in the book that Matthew mentioned earlier. And so like, the thought is basically this: that like, if there is no God, and like we assume a kind of like background evolutionary past in our background evidence, then like the transcendent experience of music is going to be an evolutionary spandrel. It's just going to be like a byproduct of other cognitive adaptations that were advantageous for survival. And so like Ortland kind of makes two arguments from this. One is an evidential argument for theism. One is a kind of axiological argument for why we should hope that theism is true. The evidential argument is just like, look, I mean, does this really seem like an accident? It really seems like some pieces of music are more beautiful than nails scratching against a whiteboard. And if that's what you think, and so like he says like, look, I guess he's saying like, look, we can go off this seeming and think like, okay, some things are more beautiful than others. But look, like the fact that we have this capacity to experience beauty and appreciate it is evidence for theism. Okay, so like whether this is true, kind of like whether I think this is true, kind of like maps onto my discussion of beauty earlier. So like if you think that the objective beauty of music is like a non-natural property, then like sure, but I'm inclined not to think that. But like on the other hand, you could interpret this as an argument from psychophysical harmony, at which point like this is just like a subsection of a subsection of like a subsection of psychophysical harmony. And like this is evidence for theism because we accepted the argument from psychophysical harmony earlier. But like that's just double counting our evidence and it's not super strong. As far as the axiological argument for theism, the axiological argument is like, well, look, I mean, which picture of music is better? One on which music is kind of evolutionary cheesecake, it's a spandrel, or like a view on which music is a means by which God allows human beings to experience the transcendent. And so like it's a means by which God is essentially like communicating to us and giving us a bridge from man to himself. And like I think he's right. Like this seems like a more beautiful picture of music. And so like conditional on like music being in the background of like the things we like, then this gives us some reason to hope that theism is true. I think that's probably right. It is a more beautiful picture of music, and like this axiological argument, I don't think depends on the claim that music is objective. You can think that the beauty of music is subjective, and still think this is a reason to favor theism, merely because like the idea that God is communicating to us through this subjectively beautiful medium is still more beautiful and like more amazing than the claim that this is an evolutionary accident.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the argument for music, it's not super convincing, but it's like, it's a subspecies of the argument for beauty, and it's a particularly moving kind of beauty. Or like, sometimes you just listen to the song "Morning Has Broken" by Cat Stevens, and you're like, okay, theism seems more plausible, now. And in addition, I think theism is a better explanation of. Ortland talks about how people have the experience of transcendence while playing music, where people often will have these sort of quasi-religious experiences where they feel like they're being tapped into the divine or something when they have music. I think that's better explained by theism. But yeah, I agree. Not a super persuasive argument. Okay, last argument. The argument from nomological harmony. Okay, 1, 2, 3, B.
A.
Wow. Okay, so what in the world is the argument from nomological harmony?
Do you want to explain this one, given that you just had Brian on your channel?
Yeah. No, I was asking a rhetorical question. I was going to go on to explain.
Okay.
Yeah. So the argument is, the laws govern the stuff that exists. And the laws that we have, they happen to line up with the stuff that exists. So you have laws that say, when there are, like you have a law like gravity, which applies to the stuff in the universe, and then you have stuff to which gravity applies. So gravity is causally efficacious. But it could have been otherwise. So it could have been that you have laws where the laws say if there are any baryons, they do this, but there aren't any baryons, and so nothing happens. And so it's very coincidental that the laws and the physical stuff line up. And so that's the idea. And then you can try to get around this by thinking that laws are just causal powers of stuff, where laws are just like, to say there's a law to do X is just saying the fundamental stuff has the causal power to do X. But then you get the problem of why the things have the causal powers to interact with the other stuff that exists. So, because you could have A's, which have the causal power to interact with B's, but not have any B's. So the A's just sit there and do nothing. And that will be vastly more probable. And so it's weird that the universe doesn't just sit there in a stillborn state doing nothing. I think it's a good argument. I don't think it's totally conclusive because it assumes non-Humeanism about causation, and Humeanism is like not terribly improbable, where Humeanism is the idea that the laws, they don't explain why things do stuff. They're just a description of the stuff that things do. And so if that's true, then the laws are just a description of the way that things behave. So then there's no coincidence of why the laws line up with the stuff that exists. And so it assumes that Humeanism is false. And I think Humeanism is probably false, but maybe I give it like 10% odds. It's not a topic I've studied that much. And so then that'll still put a cap on how strong the argument is. And then also, I think maybe you can tweak the account of what a law is if you believe in governing laws, where you say that laws are just functions that map from the initial conditions to later states. So, it doesn't even make sense to talk about inapplicable laws, because a law is just what describes the evolution of the system. And so then if that's true, I think that undercuts the argument a bit. But I still think it's a good argument, which is why I gave it a B. And I think it would be sort of like top of the B column, where it would I think it's better than the contingency argument. Okay, so Amos, why am I wrong?
Oh yeah, so I hadn't thought about the proposal that you just gave. I guess you've been cooking on it and not sharing it with the world for tweaking the governing conception of laws. I'll have to think about that more. So I mean, I find this a convincing argument for the same reason you do, namely because it's a convincing argument. But in the debate we had, the best I could do as a kind of off-the-cuff response to it was to propose the following theory: there is an infinite composable set of laws, and so this will explain why for any physical object there's a law that governs it, namely because for every physical object that could exist, there is some law out there. And so what this means is that there are there's an infinite number of laws, but only a finite number of them are in use right now. And one response that Cutter and Saad give in the paper is that well, look, I mean, why wouldn't we think that there could be contradictory laws or laws that cut against each other? So among the infinite set of laws, there could be a law which tells a particle to do A and a law which tells a particle to do not A. And my response to that was to say, well, this would entail a modal contradiction, because even if there were no particle that would bring out the contradiction, the thought that there could be a particle that would bring out the contradiction would make it impossible that there could be these countervailing laws, and so, but what I said in the debate was, well, if there's just an infinite string of laws, that's a very simple hypothesis, because infinites are more simple than specific finite numbers, as Matthew was arguing about theism, right? Infinite properties, infinite goodness, infinite power, and so on, are more intrinsically probable than power to the nth degree. But the reason why this doesn't work, as Matthew says, is that it still has a very low intrinsic probability. So consider two infinite sets of laws that one could have. One set is A, B, C. The other set is not A, not B, not C. And they can't co-instantiate, because then you get the modal contradiction that I just described. The proposal doesn't give you any reason to think that like the ABC chain of laws would be the infinite chain of laws and not the not A, not B, not C chain of laws. And so like that's one thing. Another thing is that like it doesn't give you any reason to think that induction would hold. So one kind of conceivable set of non-contradictory laws would be like a set of laws where a law only applies to a particular thing at a given moment of time. And then like once that moment passes, a different law applies to that object at the next moment of time. And if that were true, then like you'd have no reason to think that induction would hold from one moment to the next, because like at one moment there could be a law that sustains me in being as I am, but then at the next moment there could be a different law applying to me that turns me into a grand piano. And so like if we have no reason to think that like to think a priori that like the set of laws would allow for induction to hold, that undermines inductive inferences. And so like to get around that, you need to just specify that it's the induction friendly infinite set of laws. But that again reduces the intrinsic probability of the theory. So I don't think like positing an infinite chain of compossible laws is a good explanation, even though it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so have I convinced you that it's a B tier argument?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Wow, I'm so convincing. Okay, well, so you have the definitive list on the strengths of arguments for God. So, if anyone ever makes an argument below B tier, then you should laugh at them and say, what an idiot for making that argument. This person doesn't even know the definitive list of the convincing arguments. Then you should slap them, and then steal their money.
Do you want to just summarize for people who have maybe joined the stream later, like which arguments are in which tier?
I think people can read.
Okay.
Well, okay. I guess for most of these, a picture of Olaf is a little bit hard to read. Okay, so psychophysical harmony is the fact that the mental and the physical pair together in harmonious ways. That's S tier. The fine-tuning argument is the fact that the constants and the laws are such as to generate complexity. The anthropic argument is the fact that I exist, which is more strongly predicted on the hypothesis that there are lots of people. And so theism gives you a reason to think that all possible people would exist, which makes my existence probable. So then A tier is moral knowledge, which is the fact that we have the reliable faculties for having knowledge about morality and modality and math and stuff, which is more strongly predicted on theism, because in order to have a justified belief about something, then your reasons for believing it have to be explained by the thing itself. But on theism, but on atheism, it's hard to see how the moral facts could move the atoms in your brain to make you believe things about morality. Then the contingency argument is B tier, which says that that there's a necessary thing, because you can't have an infinite chain of contingent things, so there has to be some necessary thing. And then it argues that that necessary thing must be God for several reasons. Then the nomological harmony argument says that it's a coincidence that the laws are paired with the physical stuff that exists, so that the universe doesn't just sit in a stillborn state. Then the cosmological argument says everything which begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, so it must have had a cause. If it had a cause, the cause is God. And so God exists. It's defended by people like William Lane Craig. Then the existence of laws is the fact that there are physical laws, which is more strongly predicted on theism, because on atheism, it's perfectly possible that there could have been laws that sit around doing nothing. The argument from eternal love argues that the fact that we're currently around to engage in loving relationships is more strongly predicted on the hypothesis that love lasts forever, which is more strongly predicted on the hypothesis of theism. the argument from common consent is that lots of people believe in theism and believe in miracles and other things that lend support to theism. And if something is nearly universally believed, that gives you some evidence that it's true. The argument for beauty is the fact that there's so much beauty in the natural world and that we can grasp beauty and things like that. The ontological argument says that we can deduce God's existence from laws of logic based on the fact that God's like possible or something like that. The argument from miracles and from the resurrection, it says that there's good historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, but that's better explained by theism. So theism's true. The argument from music says that music's better explained by theism. And the moral argument says that if there's no God, then objective moral values and duties don't exist, but they do exist if God exists. So that's the list, the definitive list. So if apologists should stop making the moral argument and start making the anthropic argument is the core takeaway. Okay, do we have any any closing thoughts? Any last things to say? Any like threats or like racial slurs to say or something?
I'll save the racial slurs till after the stream is over.
Yeah, any hate speech on hand? Any violent ruminations about Jewish people?
I hate the moral argument. I can tell you that. And I love the Anthropic argument.
You say you hate it, but if there is God, then what's your standard for hating it? Checkmate. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've covered it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Yeah. I love you all very dearly.
Eternally.
Okay, bye. Eternally.
Bye.
But purely on abductive grounds. Like I don't really feel it, but it's just like the probability on theism of that is high. So yeah. Okay, bye.